John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory,
Welcome to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I am your host, Leon, and this is a reading of the history of the 72nd Volunteer Infantry of the Mounted Lightning Brigade. Chapter 18. From January 8th to February 19th, 1863. Recapitulation of result of first 6 months of service. Resignations, deaths, discharges, and desertions. Our sick and dead left all along our line of hard marches. Hard duty and short rations at Murfreesboro. The endless chain of mules. Tardy repairing of the railroad. Officers dismissed. Scouts to Franklin, Liberty, and other places. A hoss, my kingdom for a hoss. Talk of mounting. Captain Pinkerton's prayer. Discouraging and encouraging letters. The power of our heroic women. Testing the 72nd by 2 paces to the front. A hypocrite and a spy shot. Deserter's head shaved and check branded with a red-hot iron. First payday. An incident. Move camp from the old death pit into an open field. The 72nd sent for a little lumber and brings in a sawmill. Surrender, you damned Yank. Surrender, you damned Reb. The rebels attack Hall's brigade and are defeated. Imposing funeral ceremonies. We have now been in the service 5 months from enlistment, and this point marks an epoch in the history of our regiment. From the day of our entering Camp Tippecanoe and our muster at Indianapolis. We have been constantly on the move, hardly staying long enough to any one place to get our camp fitted up and our clothes washed. Here we began a season of camp life which lasts almost 6 months. It seems but yesterday since we left our homes of peace and plunged into the midst of the strife. But let us take a brief retrospect, and we shall see what sad changes have been wrought in those short, to us, long months. Adjutant Rice, who, if not the father of the regiment, was a father to it, had been promoted to Adjutant General on General Reynolds' staff. Major Samuel C. Kirkpatrick to the Lieutenant Colonelcy. Captain Henry M. Carr, Company B, to the majority. And Captain Jesse Hill, Company I, to the chaplaincy of the regiment. The following had resigned. Captains Henry Wilson, E. Robert La Follette, D. First Lieutenants Ira Brown, I. George Ross, K. Second Lieutenants George Ruger, C. George W. Ward, H. James H. Whitcomb, K. David H. Ashman, D. A total loss of 9 commissioned officers, one of whom, Captain Wilson, had died after resignation. The losses of non-commissioned officers and privates by death, discharge, and desertion for the same period were as follows. Company A died 2, discharged 4, deserted 1. Company B died 5, discharged 2, deserted 1. Company C died 6, discharged 1, deserted 1. Company D 0, discharged 2, deserted 0. Company E died 4, discharged 5, deserted 1. Company F died 10, discharged 1, deserted 1. Company G died 4, discharged 4, deserted 3. Company H died 3, discharged 2, deserted 2. Company I died 4, discharged 6, deserted 1. Company K died 5, Discharged 2. Deserted 4. Totals: died 43. Discharged 29. Deserted 15. Making a loss of 9 officers and 87 men. A total loss of 96 in 5 months. But this loss of 1/3 of the commissioned officers and 1/10 of the men is but a faint representation of the terrible suffering and losses which our short service has caused. We had left our dead all along the line of our marches, and our sick and exhausted in every hospital. Many were lingering in the hospitals at the date of this recapitulation who died afterwards from the effects of the hardships of our first 5-month service. To prove this, it is only necessary to go back to the starting point and note the deaths in the various hospitals. 2 died at Jeffersonville, 7 at New Albany, 13 at Louisville, 2 at Frankfort, 2 at Bardstown, 7 at Bowling Green, 6 at Scottsville, 27 at Gallatin, 4 at Nashville, 24 at Murfreesboro, making a total of 94 who died within 6 weeks after we got to Murfreesboro. That is, 43 men had died by January 8, 1863, the date of our going into camp at Murfreesboro, and 51 died in the next 6 weeks. The Hartsville Run and the Morgan Chase had in 6 weeks been more fatal than all the battles our regiment was ever in. In the first 6 months of our service, 3 times as many men died as were killed during the whole 3 years' service of the regiment. We have no data from which to calculate the number finally discharged for disability contracted before we reached Murfreesboro. But assuming that the rate of discharge was the same as the death rate, the result is 70 discharged. A loss of some 189 men and 10 commissioned officers. A total loss of 199. 1/5 of the regiment, as a result of the first 5 months' service. Had this rate of loss been continued, the entire regiment would have been dead or discharged in 25 months. Few will differ from the statement that the severest period on the health of the regiment had been almost past. General Rosecrans' whole army of 47,000 was lying in and around Murfreesboro, and with all the speed the proper points were strongly fortified and all approaches were picketed. There were details for fatigue duty on fortifications, and hard work for many days after we pitched camp, in those miserable Hickory Flats. The question for getting rations forward from Nashville, a distance of 35 miles, was a very serious one. The railroad had been torn up by the rebels during the late battle, and was in a painfully slow process of repair. Every day, 300 wagons loaded with rations, each wagon drawn by 6 mules, left Nashville for Murfreesboro. Every day, 300 such teams left Murfreesboro for Nashville to be in their turn loaded and sent back with rations. Thus an endless chain of mule teams was moving on this pike all the time, drawing supplies for this great army. And as it rained a great deal, no wonder that pike became next to impassable. Teams were 3 days regularly, and often 4 days on the road from Nashville to Murfreesboro. It required a long time to get enough provisions up for full rations for the army, though the teams at first brought in 2,000 loads a week. It took about 3 months to put the railroad in running order, and 5 months to accumulate military stores sufficient to move on Bragg at Shelbyville, Tennessee, who, during this delay, had grown stronger than ever before. What a contrast between the manner in which the army was supplied at this time and during the last 2 years of the war, when Sherman would have had the cars running in 2 days, and his men would never have lost a ration, as he did on the Atlanta campaign. All this time we were hard at work on fortifications and picket duty, and in addition scouring and scraping the country for forage. And the rebels were bolder and more defiant than ever they had been before, and hardly a day passed when they did not attack some post or foraging party, and often with success. The first day we were at Murfreesboro, a detail of 100 men from our regiment was sent on picket. Captain Watson command. He was ordered to picket in front of our division, and to connect his lines with the pickets on the right and left. It was very dark and rainy, and he could find no lines to connect with, but posted his men the best he could and waited for daylight to find the other pickets. We were very short of rations, and Captain Watts had none at all, except what of the men of his company gave him. Just at daylight, he went to a house to get something to eat, and while gone, the officer of the day, the major of the 17th Indiana, came and found him off his post, and as soon as he returned, put him under arrest and subsequently preferred charges against him, for which he was dismissed on the 20th of January by order of General Reynolds. Colonel Miller says, "This was all wrong, and it was so regarded by everybody in the regiment, as by it Company I lost its best officer. We may also here speak of Lieutenant Orrin E. Harper, Company F, who was dismissed the service on March 2nd of the same year, and of whose dismissal Colonel Miller says, in equally emphatic terms, it should have never been done. And Hornada of Company F says that Lieutenant Harper was at once father and brother to the company." On the 23rd of January, our regiment went out 15 miles in the direction of Franklin to guard a forage train. We became aware that the enemy was making a movement for our capture, and began a speedy return to camp, bringing in our train all right, and making a 30-mile march. Just as we got back, we met a force going out to our relief, as General Reynolds had been apprised of the movements of the enemy and feared we would be cut off. That was as brisk a march, especially returning, as the regiment ever made, except when it ran to Hartsville. In going out before danger was apprehended, we passed through a section where things were pretty plenty, and the boys managed some way, bought them we suppose, to get a hold of hams, shoulders, fresh side meat, cabbage, chickens, geese, turkeys, and etc., which were stuck onto or hung onto their bayonets, and although the return march was very rapid, not a man would part with any of this newly acquired property, and brought it all into camp. We have known of soldiers throwing away blankets, clothing, knapsacks, and even guns on occasions. But who ever heard of a soldier throwing away a ham, a chicken, a cabbage head, or any such thing? Very few. It will be impossible to mention all the scouts we made while lying at Murfreesboro, and therefore we select the most important ones. On the morning of February 3rd, Reynolds' division started to Liberty, the object being to make a forced march and surprise the enemy at that place. The division moved briskly to Auburn. Near one of the enemy's pickets was captured, and it was learned that the rebels had a force of about 1,500 at Liberty. On Wednesday, the 4th, it was clear and cold. We got ready to move on the enemy at daylight, the 1st Brigade having the advance, and moved so cautiously that it took all day to march 7 miles. And when we got to Liberty, we found the enemy had been gone some time. We might as well have surprised and captured them. When we got to Liberty, we marched 8 miles in pursuit on a road the rebels did not take and camped at Alexandria. It was a very severe night of rain and snow. On that night, 2 of our brigade were captured by the rebels. On the 5th, we moved 20 miles. The rebels following in our rear closely all the time to pick up any unfortunate man who could not keep up, or any stragglers. On the 6th, it was clear and cold, and we passed through Lebanon, Tennessee, and went into camp at Bird's Mills, on the Murfreesboro Road, 6 miles from Lebanon. On the 7th, we got on the road early, Hall's brigade taking the front, the wagon trains following, and the 72nd some half-mile behind the train. While passing through a dense cedar thicket, which had once been infested by robbers, but now by guerrillas, the latter swarmed out from the thicket and attacked the train furiously. The train would have been captured, too, had it not been for some men of Company I, who being footsore had been permitted to start in advance. They were right at the place the attack was made, and opened fire on the assailants, driving them into the woods. The 72nd quickly formed the line of battle and came to the rescue, and Lilly's battery shelled the woods, which were too dense for troops to penetrate in any sort of order. The rebels lost 2 killed and 5 captured in this little affair. Sergeant Sam Taylor, of Company I, played a clever piece of strategy on this occasion. His feet were so crippled that he could hardly walk at all. He had strapped his gun on his knapsack, and with a cane in each hand was moving along with the greatest difficulty. But when the rebels attacked the train, he threw both canes away, and ran like a buck back to the regiment. When the boys raised a great laugh at this sudden cure, he said, "Well, what the deuce could I do but run? My gun was strapped to my back so I could not get it off, and the way the Johnnies were pampering them old wagon boxes, I was afraid they might hit me." "But how about your feet?" asked the boys. "Oh, they don't hurt me a bit now. I don't think I shall need a cane any more today," he replied. Taylor was a good soldier, and ever after was always ready. Another little incident to show the spirit of the 72nd, when near Murfreesboro, late in the evening, something obstructed the movements of Hall's brigade, and our regiment had to stand in column until their legs ached and their patience was exhausted, moving a rod or two and waiting. When they reached the obstruction, which had so long detained them, they found it to be a big mud hole, over which Hall's brigade had passed single file on a rail. When our men saw what it was, they called out to Colonel Miller, "If your horse can go through it, we can." The horse rode through it, and the mud and water was only knee-deep to the horse. At once, the men raised the yell they used on charging rebel works and dashed through it double-quick 4 abreast. We crossed Stone River on a bridge of wagons drawn up side by side, and got into our camp at Murfreesboro at 10 o'clock at night, muddy, tired, and ravenously hungry. The result of this trip was 50 prisoners and 3 rebels killed. During this month, there began to be considerable talk about mounting the regiment. At first, there were a large majority of men and officers opposed to it. They said they had enlisted and been drilled as infantry, and they didn't want to become cavalry. But the many scouts we had to make through the mud and over the hills, fording mud holes and streams on foot, brought us to the conclusion that if we had to do cavalry duty, we would prefer to have horses to ride. This was especially the case on a scout began on February 17th and continued to the 19th towards Trin, about 12 miles from Murfreesboro. It rained very hard. The streams became high and the roads desperately muddy, and the cry of Richard could be heard all along the line at every stream and extra bad piece of road. A hoss, my kingdom for a hoss. This trip was prolonged to the 19th, on the account of high waters, and when the men got back to camp, they were for mounting by a large majority. After driving at Murfreesboro, there were some who expressed dissatisfaction with the President's Emancipation Proclamation. One day, a lieutenant visited the headquarters of Company G, was invited to stay and take dinner, and accepted. Dinner was spread on a table made of ammunition boxes in the little tent. The outlay was plain and the beans not overdone. While eating, the question of the proclamation came up. The visiting lieutenant said, in a fretful, complaining spirit, "Well, if I were living here in the South and such a proclamation should be issued, I'd feel like fighting the government forever before giving up my property." "You don't quite approve the proclamation, then?" quietly suggested someone. "No, sir. Decidedly, I don't. I think it's an outrage upon the rights of property." Captain Pinkerton could stand it no longer, and brought his fist down with violence upon the table, knocking a tin platter of beans and sour belly to the top of the tent, as he said with such emphasis as to blow the beans out of his mouth until they rattled like musket balls against the side of the tent. "Lieutenant, I say any man who will talk that way, damn him! Damn him! Damn him!" hitting the table to emphasize each damn. "I'm not swearing now, either. I'm praying. I'm praying. I'm praying. Such disloyalty is contemptible." The lieutenant didn't pursue the subject, but did very soon peruse his way from that tent of earnest, pointed prayer, not caring to be prayed for after that fashion. In this connection, we mentioned that there were many discouraging letters sent to many of the men by who's at home who opposed the administration. The Emancipation Proclamation and the talk of arming Negroes were seized upon to encourage desertion. Some men received letters telling them that if they would desert and come home, they would be protected against arrest and punishment. But we say with pride that these letters were almost universally spurned. Many of them were handed over to the officers, and some of them sent home to be filed with the county officers of the counties from which they were sent. In this hour of peril to the Union cause, many thousands of the wives, mothers, sisters, and sweethearts of our soldiers wrote them letters exhorting them to be firm, gallant, and hopeful, to not waver in the least degree in facing all the dangers and hardships of field and camp. These letters were a power for good, which can never be fully measured. We have many such letters before us, which show what heroines our women were in those fiery, bloody days. Had not the women been brave, and ready to suffer privation with patience and courage, we are candid in saying that the Union cause might have failed. We speak from personal knowledge when we say that many a soldier was led to desertion by letters from wife, mother, sister, or some lady friend. Others, who were too honorable to violate their oaths, became heartbroken and died of homesickness, pining away in unutterable anguish, dying by inches. We know of such cases, and mention a few. One day, we were asked to walk with a noble soldier. We had been in the field but 4 months. When some distance from camp, he pulled a letter from his pocket, which he asked us to read. It was indeed a pitiable document. The wife of the man had written it and filled it with the most agonizing entreaties for him to get off in some way and come home. She told of how she dreamed of seeing him dead, and when she fell asleep and awoke screaming with anguish, how she wept by day and by night, how her 3 little children joined in her sorrow and refused to be comforted. The poor fellow sat on a log and shook with emotion. We told him to write her cheerful letters, to insist on her believing that he would come out all right, and that he was not in half as much danger as she supposed. "I have done all that," he replied. "I have written to her over and over, but to no purpose. She began to write me in this way as soon as I left for the front, and twice a week, on an average, I have such letters." The letters grew worse. His wife became so weak from grief that she was bedfast. The poor fellow could not get home. He became melancholy, took sick, and simply perished, slain by grief. Many similar instances we knew, and give one more. A young man entered the service as a line officer, leaving a young wife at home. For 2 years she wrote him brave, cheerful letters. The fearful campaigns of 1864 came on. The line officer had become a field officer. His wife read in the papers of the fearful carnage, and her heart became heavy with an awful dread that her husband's name might be in the next list of killed. She began to write the most depressing letters to her husband. Her health was delicate. The officer idolized his wife. His courage failed. He became cowed, if not a coward. He was now in command of the regiment, but he rode at its head no more. He was not sick enough to be in the hospital. He was not well enough to be in the front. He lost reputation amongst those who had admired him for his courage, and went out of the service almost in disgrace, and quite in contempt of his command. It is proper to say this officer was not a 72nd man. Wonderful was the power of a brave, sensible wife, mother, sister, or sweetheart, over a soldier in the field. Such women could make first-rate soldiers of men who, without such a power over them, would have been very poor military material, if not worthless. Good letters from home would often make a sick man almost well. It was a reply often given, when one soldier would say to another, who was not well, "How are you today?" "Oh, I am almost well. I got a bully letter from mother or sister or wife today. It does me good all over." At the risk of being tedious, we give a few quotations from letters. A mother who had been left with 5 little children in a log house on a rented farm in the forest writes to her husband, who was a private, quote, "Well, when you left home, you know we both promised that we would tell each other, once a week if possible, all that happened. I have your last letter, and I thank our Father, which art in heaven, that it is so well with you. When I think of your exposure and hardships on these cold nights, and your dangers beside, I know that I am blessed with ease and comfort, and feel that I have hardly any right to so much ease, when you and others have so many hardships. It snowed hard last night, and when I got up in the morning I found snow 3 inches deep all over the floor. Little Mattie looked out of the bed from under cover and said, 'Mamma, do you think it snowed on Papa last night? She is so sweet.' Frank said, 'No, it didn't either, for he's got a tent, and God covers him up with a blanket every night. I had sent to mill for meal 3 days ago, but hadn't got any yet. But I had but little breakfast for the children and myself, and we all ate it with thanks, only hoping that you had as much and as good. I am now at Uncle's, and we are all right. I walked through the deep snow and carried Katie on my shoulders and the baby in my arms. The other children walked. We pray for you all the time. We think you will come home. Be cheerful and happy about us. Take care of yourself. I know we will conquer, and am glad we are doing all we can," and etc. Unquote. While passing through a hospital one day, a soldier boy called to us to come and read a letter from his mother. The letter was written by his mother after the reception of the news of the loss of her son's leg in battle. It was as full of consolation as the famous dialogue of Hugh and his mother and the old school readers. When we had done the reading, he eagerly asked, "Isn't that a good letter?" To this we replied affirmatively, and he said, "I tell you, I feel proud of my mother, and I just wish I had a dozen legs to lose in the defense of my country, just because she loves it so well. She has always written me the bulliest letters you ever read. I have a big stock of them, and when I used to get cowardly or blue, I would take one of these letters and read it, and I'd be all right again." A sister wrote to her brother in almost these words, quote, "Well, Scott has finally gone to the war. He got into the 73rd Indiana some way or other. He must have told a fib about his age, as he is not old enough by at least 18 months. You know Seth and Taylor went into the 7th Indiana Zouaves. John went into Colonel Coburn's regiment, James went into the 143rd Indiana, and you into the 72nd Indiana. This takes the 6 boys, every boy in the family. We all thought Father would be greatly broken down when his last and youngest son left him, but it is not so. He really wants to go himself so much that he can hardly sleep. If he could get in by a little fib about his age as easily as Scott did, I really do think he would hardly hesitate to tell it. He now puts his age 5 years younger than he did before all his boys went into the army. I really believe that he is prouder of these 6 sons in the army than he would be of a big old bag of gold. We women folk help Father do the outdoor work, and we will do our part gladly and pray for you all, and send you all the little favors we can. We know the time has come when brothers must fight and sisters must pray at home, and work as well as pray." The following is part of a letter written by his sweetheart to a member of the 72nd Company I. Dear friend, it may be that we shall never meet again on earth, and that I shall never again see your dear face, or hear your words assuring me of your affections. It may be that your body, invigorated by disease, weakened by privation, or smitten by the enemy, shall be left to molder on the battlefield or in a strange land. Yet in your last moments, though left to die on the cold ground, pierced by the enemy's balls, with no friendly voice to soothe your last moments, no kind hand to close your dying eyes, I know your last thoughts will be of her who writes these lines to you. Such a fate would indeed be hard, and would cause me an unutterable pain and long sorrow. Yet she who wishes you happiness and prosperity on earth, and a home in heaven, writes to say that with all her love for you, with all her desire for your safety, she thinks it is better for you to go and fight for your country, share the toils and hardships of those who are in the field, and the worst fate that could possibly befall you, than to remain at home with kindred and friends, and all that the heart holds dear, and see the old flag trodden under the feet of traitors, and our splendid government destroyed. What are home and friends without liberty? I love you all the more because you are a patriot soldier. The braver you are, the more I will love you. Be assured that the few hours we have passed together will never be forgotten by me. Whatever befalls you, if you die like a brave soldier, I will ever hold you sacred in memory. If you return safe from the field, having done nobly your duty, I will receive you with delight. We might multiply these specimens of heroism displayed by our noble women during the war, but it is useless. Before the mind of son, husband, brother, and lover, in the toil and conflict of camp, march and bloody field, stood the fair angelic forms of those dear ones whose love and esteem was more precious than life. In such presence none but cravens could be cowards. Every brave soldier will say, God bless the noble Union women for their grand words and deeds during the war. They were equal to legions of angels. While we lay at Murfreesboro, some time after the Battle of Stone River, Colonel Miller got a hint that there was considerable discontentment in his regiment. He could have no patience for a soldier who made the course of the government a pretext for not fully doing his sworn duty. He therefore determined that he would sift out the souls of his men. Accordingly, one evening on dress parade, he made a short statement to the regiment of which he had heard but did not believe. He said he would ask, not command, those who were determined to stand honorably to their oaths and do their sworn duty, to step 2 paces to the front. If there were any in the regiment who desired to violate their oaths, they might stand still, that he and all others might see them. He then requested all who were determined to stand by their oaths and do their duty 2 paces forward. The whole noble old 72nd bounded 2 steps to the front, with a promptness and energy that satisfied its brave colonel that there was not a man in it who was less than a loyal, whole man. The colonel said he knew he was not disappointed in his regiment, and that this action gave the unanimous damned lie to its slanderers. The colonel, like Captain Pinkerton, and sundry other officers and men, prayed a little sometimes, and this was one of those times. Shortly after we went into camp at Murfreesboro, there came into camp a strange kind of man, dressed in citizen's clothing, who pretended to be very religious, saying he had been sent by the Christian Commission. He carried a good supply of paper, stamps, envelopes, and other notions, which we very much needed, and gave them to all who could not pay for them. For a time he came into our camp nearly every day, talked, sang, and encouraged us to be good men and soldiers. His manner was to get upon a stump and sing patriotic songs, many of his own composition, about Morgan and Bragg, Rosecrans's great victory over Bragg, and other epics. He had a good voice, a pleasant address, and we enjoyed his visits. The regiment would gather around him in large numbers, hear his songs and exhortations, receive his notions, and then he would go to the next regiment and repeat. And so he put in his time. After keeping this up for about 2 weeks, General Negley had him arrested on suspicion of being a spy. He was put into the provost guardhouse in Murfreesboro, which was a long storeroom. One dark, rainy night, the guard fell asleep, and the fellow slipped by him. A 72nd man, who was present, gave the alarm and told the guard to go after the fellow and bring him back. The guard was afraid to leave his post, and the rascal would soon have escaped had not the 72nd man seized a gun, ran after him, and bid him to halt. But he would not halt, and the soldier shot him dead. On examination of the body the next morning, a complete map of the fortifications about Murfreesboro was found on him, even to the positions of the various regiments. He was one of Bragg's spies, and met a spy's fate. On Sunday, March 1st, a man in the 75th Indiana who had been tried by a court-martial for desertion and an attempt to kill an officer, received the execution of the sentence. Reynolds' whole division was drawn up in line without arms on the McMinnville Pike to witness the deed. The condemned man, handcuffed, was marched to the front and center of the division, where a fire was burning briskly. He was seated on a stool near the fire. A barber lathered his head until it was white as snow, and then proceeded to shave it until it was bare as the palm and as slick as an onion. This done, his head was firmly held while Colonel Wilder took a red-hot iron from the fire and pressed it against the right cheek. A sizz and jet of steam. The iron is withdrawn, and there is a large red D upon the cheek. The bands all began to play the Rogue's March, while the deserter was taken to the extreme left of the division and marched along its front, bare-headed, with the great D showing fiery red. 2 soldiers following him with bayonets pointed at his hips. A drum and fife in rear playing the Rogue's March. Stripped to the waist, with a single blanket rolled up and swung about his shoulder, a canteen of water, and 1 day's rations. The wretch shivered as he passed along before us, and most of the men will say that during their service they never saw a more revolting, pitiable spectacle. He was taken beyond the Union lines, north of Murfreesboro, and set adrift with the assurance that if ever he came back, he would be shot. This was severe, but it became necessary to preserve the discipline of the army. Others in other corps were treated like this man. Some were shot and others hung, yet there were still some cases of desertion and criminal conduct. On the 3rd of March, our division started on a scout towards Woodbury, taking 9 days' rations, and the first night out camped at Readyville. The next day we went out on a forage scout and got forage off of ground where never before had forage been got without a fight for it. While taking forage, we saw a soldier undertake to get a horse from a house in the hills, for it was a very hilly country. He had bridled the horse and was leading it away, when a young woman of the house got a hickory gad and belabored him unmercifully over the head that he had to let it go. The brave girl seized a 10-year-old boy, threw him on the horse, and told him to skip out quick, and in a twinkling he was out of sight. This brave act of the girl was greeted by rounds of applause by our soldiers. On the 5th, our brigade remained quietly in camp at Readyville, while Hall's brigade foraged. On the 6th, we marched rapidly to Woodbury to surprise a rebel force, a detachment of Morgan's command, the 72nd in advance. We left on our advance and escaped, as was usually the case when infantry undertook to capture cavalry. There was a heavy rain during that day and a furious storm at night, resulting in much suffering and subsequent illness. This expedition returned on the 8th to the old camp at Murfreesboro with 500 loads of forage, with blistered feet, shouting, "A hoss! A hoss, my kingdom for a hoss!" They were wet, muddy, tired, hungry, and generally out of fix. At this time, some of the 17th Indiana had been mounted, and the 72nd had become convinced that it was easiest walking when a man has a horse in his hand. As there seemed a determination to use us as horses, we decided to have horses to help us out. While absent on this march, a lot of Indiana troops were captured at Franklin, including John C. Coburn's brigade, which we heard when we returned to camp. Payday came at last, and for the first time on the 10th of March, it rained the whole day, and many of us got soaking wet as we waited patiently about the paymaster's tent. We were paid to the end of the year, December 31st, 1862. The men and officers settled all their bills to that date with the commissary and quartermaster. And what was of most importance to the men, the officers paid them all loans. This left the men in funds, and most of them happy, especially those who had families and who needed money very much to send home for the actual wants of their wives and children. We here mention what one of the officers wishes spoken of, but does not want his name used. That had it not been for the generosity of the privates and non-commissioned officers, we got a bounty and advanced pay, many of the commissioned officers could hardly have remained in the service, for it would have given them much trouble to have gotten uniforms and swords on entering the service and provisions to the state. There never were a more generous lot of men mustered than were those of the 72nd. There was scarce a man so mean that he would not pay his debts on payday. There was a wonderful amount of settling and balancing all around to do that night, and it was after midnight before the adjustments were made and the men lay down to rest. The Chuck-a-Luck men didn't lay down at all. They ran all night, and almost perpetually until the greenbacks were exhausted. On March 12th, our regiment furnished 300 men for picket, and it took almost every well man in camp. On the 14th of March, we moved out of camp in the Hickory Flats and the field near the Pike, about 200 yards north, on to the ground for a long time occupied by the 18th Indiana Battery. Although this was but a very slight move, it was like passing from one world to another. It is putting it gently to say that the old Hickory Swamp Camp was a death pit. It rained much while we lay in it, and the water could not be drained off, and the best police tents were often overflowed. And the sinks, excuse us, comrades, for naming these horrid pools of putridity, surrounded by those treacherous poles and in treacherous wooden forks, and the more treacherous earth at the edges, those horrid pits in which many a luckless soldier had received the baptism of total depravity, sent up their noxious vapors day and night to poison the air. Often in that camp at night, while laying with the car near the ground, have we heard a chorus of graveyard coughing, as the men called it, in which 300 to 400 men joined. This camp, with the hard scouting, picket and fatigue duty that had to be done, broke many an iron constitution and sent many to the grave and hospital. The strong will and frame of Colonel Miller could not stand it, and he was very ill for a time. The memory of that camp is a misery. Men often died in their tents who were able to get about a little, and many died suddenly in hospital. Camp diarrhea in its most malignant form prevailed. Men would pass from their bowels from a pint or 2 quarts of bloody matter, or pure blood. Their bowels literally decomposed. Many comrades who have survived to this day, February 1882, almost 20 years, still suffer from disease contracted in that camp, and will yet take them to the grave. Many a brave man and officer was forced to leave us that would have given half his head to have gone through the service with the regiment. But here we are, out on a rolling piece of ground where the sun shines on us, and it is now so warm that the peach bloom is already out, and swelling buds are giving a sweet tinge of green to the woods. The winter is over, and if it does rain, the water runs from our camp and is not mixed with snow. On the 17th of March, the 72nd was sent out after some lumber and brought in a sawmill. Men were dying very rapidly, and there was not enough lumber in the army to make them rough coffins. When we got out to the mill, the thing looked so small and so handy that we just thought we'd put the lumber on our wagons and borrow an ox cart and bring in the mill, which we proceeded to execute in neat style. While the mill was being loaded, one of the pioneers felt the power of the sun, or the graybacks in his hog hair shirt felt it, and he slipped off into the woods, sat down on a log, drew off his shirt, and began to skirmish for graybacks. While thus intently engaged, one of Morgan's mounted graybacks rode up, covered the half-naked pioneer with a pistol, and demanded, "Surrender, you damned Yank." Of course, the pioneer could do nothing but comply with his order, and threw up his hands in token of surrender. But the tables turned on the rebel just then and there. Just behind the fence, Corporal H.W. Monroe, of Company H, lay with a squad of 6 men, and they all raised with rifles cocked and leveled at the rebel. And Corporal Monroe sung out, "Surrender, you damned rebel," which he proceeded to do without parley, to the great delight of the pioneer. The rebel said his first impulse was to run, but when he looked into the muzzles of 6 guns covering him at short range, he thought he'd better climb down and stay a while. On March 19th, Hall's brigade of our division made a scout to the vicinity of Liberty, where they were attacked by and had a hard fight with Morgan. Our brigade was ordered to hold itself in readiness to march to the relief of Hall at a moment's notice. His brigade repulsed Morgan with a loss of 6 men and 40 wounded. The dead and wounded were brought into Murfreesboro, and the dead buried with the honors of war. The whole division turned out to take part in the solemn ceremonies. The division, massed by regiments, formed a hollow square around the large grave in which the dead were buried. A funeral sermon was preached by one of the chaplains to at least 10,000 men, before the bodies were covered with earth. After the bodies were covered, the battalion, formed of details taken from the regiments to which the dead belonged, fired 3 rounds over the fresh-made grave of their comrades. This was the heaviest firing by volley we ever heard, and, taken all in all, was the grandest funeral we ever saw. There was scarcely a day passed without someone being killed. Some after the above funeral. A colonel of cavalry was killed and buried with the honors of war, a full brigade band taking part in the services. We never heard such music before or since. Smith's March was played. Each instrument played a solo and played in response to each other. And when all joined in the full chorus, the outburst was grand and thrilling, going to the very fountains of the soul. A detail of men bore the colonel's body on a catafalque, slowly to the grave, and just behind it came the colonel's horse, saddled, bridled, and equipped with his revolvers, boots, spurs, and sword. The horse followed without anyone leading him, and the noble animal seemed the saddest mourner in the funeral train. It was truly such a funeral as the poet speaks of. And when the hero dieth, his comrades in the war, with muffled drums and arms reversed, follow the funeral car. They tell the banners taken, they tell the battles won, and after him led his masterless steed, while peals the minute gun. Chapter 19 will be next week. We have a very long episode, 50 minutes we made it to, before we even got into our notes. So let's get into this incredible chapter that covers so much. Oh my goodness. And gives us a real in-depth ability to look into the regiment as it's suffering through its privations. Absolutely beautiful. All right, let's get into it. Alrighty. So I feel like it takes about 6 months for soldiers to become soldiers. Especially with the modern infantry, you're kind of babied so much, and I mean that in a very, very nice way. I know that there's infantrymen everywhere right now who their eyes are coming glued out of their sockets because they're like, it wasn't easy. And I mean that in the sense of that in the modern military, we understand that nobody's body can just become an infantryman right off the bat, that it takes time and practice to get acclimated to it, which is something that I think these soldiers, other than the fact of them not understanding how bacteria works, they have a really good 6-month-long program of being able to turn into hardened soldiers that not everyone else has gotten in the histories and memoirs that we've read. So I feel like this is a considerable difference. These soldiers did get an adjustment period, but it was an adjustment period on the march. And so they were constantly moving, always on their way, and they just started taking casualties. And they hadn't even fought any real battles. So the first 2 weeks they signed up. From the first 2 weeks they signed up, all the way until they joined the army in the Cumberland, they have yet to fire a shot in real anger, but they've taken 199 men in casualties, which is just insane, especially in any format that you think about it. I guess, except for the Russians going on right now, that nobody really takes casualties like that anymore. So we're also going to take a moment to talk about the provisions needed for the Army of the Cumberland and how slow that takes in 1862, and the difference that is notated in this memoir when General Sherman is in charge. And McGee says, end quote, when Sherman would have had the cars running in 2 days and his men never lost a ration as he did on the Atlanta campaign. What a powerful statement for administrative prowess for Sherman. Much what makes the difference between thinking about army commanders during the war, just how much they could actually make happen with speed and intensity when they really wanted to. So when this regiment finally gets to Murfreesboro, and something I want to note is that the constant contact with the enemy is capture, trading, and shooting at each other. And it seems to be kind of all of this mixed together on like this very local level where you're not having armies, but just dudes out running around, which seems very weird to think about. But how we imagine the Confederate Army, I think, needs to be maybe not as direct as we kind of think about it now. It sounds like there's just a lot of Confederate soldiers running around causing mischief. So next we're going to talk about Sergeant Sam Taylor of Company I, whose feet were crippled due to how messed up they had gotten. But then when the rebels attacked the supply train, he ran all the way to the regiment to get help. Absolutely hilarious. I love this in my mind's eye of being able to see this as like part of a movie. In another battle, but not for the whole regiment, just for part of it. And adrenaline makes the body do crazy things. So he was probably like, yeah, you know what? I guess I can walk after all. But then the next day, his feet probably went right back to hurting just like they did the last time. So been there and have felt that, that's for sure. Now, let's see. They briefly talk about a horse, a kingdom for a horse. We're getting closer to that mounted infantry unit, so we're almost there. I can't wait to see which chapter that takes place. I'm not reading ahead on purpose. But something I did find very interesting was the Emancipation Proclamation and the response that people have to that. So much is happening right now, and Abraham Lincoln is very carefully threading a needle. And this visiting LT who comes over for dinner, who's having dinner with him, is explaining like, well, hey, if the government took my property, I'd fight them forever. And obviously, in this context, property means slaves. If the government took my slaves, I'd fight them forever. Well, Captain Pinkerton, pounding the table and saying, damn him, but that he wasn't swearing, that he was praying, but that such talk is disloyalty, is just beautiful. Oh my gosh. And the letters from home telling the boys like, hey, it's just not worth it. You know, people don't need to be free. Such a great response to spurn those letters and just hand it over to the officers. I really like that. The next thing I want to talk about is the comment, slain by grief, in response to a soldier who dies because he got sick, but his wife is sending him torturous letters and becomes bedridden. Losing the will to fight for life, for your brothers, to get back to your family at home, It's all something to think about, and this is exactly why positivity is taught to U.S. service members, is to stay a positive and you stay alive. And I will give a brief example of how I was initially introduced to the idea of positivity, of trying to stay alive. The example was of a Marine who had been shot in Fallujah, in the Second Battle of Fallujah, loses almost all of his blood, but just kept hanging in there and kept staying alive. Like, I'm going to make it. You're going to get me back home. And he did, and he made it, but he should have died. He had enough blood loss that they were like, we're not sure how you're alive. Nobody is really sure if it's true, but that whole positive impact, right? There's really hard to do studies on staying positive and staying alive, but believing that you can, man, and getting letters home does wonders for you. So I love that this is talked about and explained about how the women back home had as much to do with the fighting on the front as they did with the home front. It's important to soldiers all over the place. And having those positive thoughts sent to them, like, hey, everything's okay. I love you. Hope you're doing well. Just, it means a lot when you're gone. And I can only imagine the amount of suffering that these guys went through with a lot of these letters that were like, things are not okay at home. You were the farmer, and now women had to learn how to do a whole lot of things while their husbands and their sons and whoever, their fathers were gone. Now, next up is General Negley having this guy arrested as a spy in Murfreesboro. We've read about this a couple of times, about spies being caught, but a complete map of the fortifications. I can only wonder what would have happened if that map had gotten back into Confederate hands. I doubt someone like Bragg would have done anything with it. And a spy's fate is always that of a dead man. That's why I always tell people, I'm like, if the CIA ever tries to recruit you, just say no. Because you never know where you're gonna end up. Now, let's talk about the real reason I had to wait so long for this episode. I just so happened to be reading The Red Badge of Courage. And at 38:27 in this episode, that's 38 minutes, 27 seconds, there's a brave girl beating some Union soldier over the head. And over a horse. She's trying to take a horse. She beats him. They're like, oh, congratulations. You fought him off. It's very cute. The Red Badge of Courage has this exact same scene, almost action for action, just without the boy in it. And after having gone back and read the Red Badge of Courage all the way through, it really comes across as a regimental history more than a book. I'm going to link the Red Badge of Courage on my website, so if you want to pick it up and read through it, by all means, I think you guys, especially if you listen to this podcast, I think you'll end up liking it maybe a little bit more than you did in the 3rd grade, or whenever it is they decided to have you read Red Badge of Courage. So, if you're used to regimental histories, go back and read the Red Badge of Courage, and then tell me what you think. Send me an email at at warofrebellion@gmail.com, because I want to hear from you. So, but if you need a hard copy or something like that, buy your own book, please. All right. So now we're going to talk very briefly about picket duty. They bring it up. The last time the regiment was put on picket duty that I can remember is that they had 500 men, and it was all that they could do to get 500 men together for picket duty. Here, they try and get everybody on picket duty, and it's only 300 men. So that effective fighting force is now getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So I wonder, by the time they do become mounted infantry, how much of their regiment is actually still around. All right. We also get a section dedicated to pints of blood. Oh, the imagery that is described here is very hard to get out of your head. But pints of blood coming out of soldiers while they're trying to go to the bathroom. Folks, keep your water clean. This is something Americans don't die from often anymore, and for good reason. Always make sure your water's clean. Oh, it's just so awful. To make sure that your water source is clean. Oh, I feel so bad for these guys. And it's described as literally as their bowels are decomposing while they're still alive. And I absolutely believe soldiers are, more than one soldier got his pension over his diarrhea. I am sure. Absolutely. Another section there's a music alert where he mentions Smith's March is played. A curious thing that I did find was I'm reading Dessa Rose, which is a neo-slave narrative fiction novel. A slave tries to escape in that novel and is branded on the face. So I had just read these only a couple of pages apart, or a couple of hours apart. And so to see a man in the Union Army also get branded on the face, it just seems like punishment back then regularly included branding, which is, I don't want to say a proud tradition still in the military, but if you've been in the military, then you might know someone who has been branded. I watched a U.S. Marine get branded in the barracks for no other reason other than he was like, I'm a badass and I could take it. And it happened. So branding is still an American tradition, although obviously for different reasons. We're not branding people as deserters, and obviously we're not taking enslaved people and brutally torturing them. So it was just something that was just very interesting to see that is still around. I had never thought about it. Had always known branding for things like cattle. I'm sure others know of many similar stories, but this was my first Marine Corps, my first military branding that had happened in the American Civil War that I had read about. And to know that it had been happening to slaves for a while seems to kind of perpetuate this kind of gross American tradition. But who am I to stop a man from getting drunk and telling everyone he'll get branded? He doesn't care. So, oh my goodness. Well, with that, my friends, go ahead and come check out the YouTube channel. It's going to be the end of our video, or the end of our podcast episode for today. Thank you for listening. I've been really busy with school, working on a multimodal project and a paper on the American Civil War that I have been writing using multiple sources, kind of about how the American people were tricked into Civil War because they had not actually fought any real wars since the Revolution. And almost everyone who could remember how awful that was super old or dead. So we're going to be moving on to chapter 19 next week, back to our regularly scheduled time, since I'm not like crushed under work right now. But my friends, thank you very kindly. I will be catching you in the next episode. I hope you found this one very interesting. We're just getting started. This is going to be a very long memoir, a regimental history to get through. And I will catch you in the next episode. You mush eaters, get out of here. Have a great one. Bye.
Old John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching